And we are here on day 12 of COP28 at the Expo City in Dubai. We are joined by a very special guest, Aparupa Chakravarti, who is a strategy consultant and advisor, joining us here at the studio. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolute pleasure to have you. This is day 12 of COP28. We've pretty much come to the end of it, and very happy and excited to have you here as one of our final guests. Now, Aparupa, want to talk to you a little bit about your area of specialty. Obviously, as an expert in Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, specifically in the private sector and investment advisory. Talk to us about how do you see the future of the Middle East and these regions that you work in when it comes to the private sectors and the future of investments in business?
Thank you so much, Omar. It's a big question, one that I spent a lot of time grappling with day to day over the last 10, 12 years or so that I've been working. I think one thing that has been becoming increasingly clear is that the private sector, its role, its activities, its contributions is not limited to the private sector.
Right.
And I think a really exciting thing that I have observed over my career is all the opportunities and interdependencies between the private sector, the public sector, as well as the so-called third sector, so nonprofits, non-governmental organizations, etc. And this shift has, I think, really catapulted in the past, I would say, 5 years or so, whereas before, there was a lot of disconnect between businesses and these other types of actors, and a lot of linearity in terms of how they would deal with each other. Now I think there's a lot more happening in terms of, okay, how do we come together in ways that are mutually beneficial? How do we start to speak, if not the same language, how do we find a lexicon that works for both of us? How do we create models of cooperation and partnership that are not one-sided or that are not super conventional, and we can really sort of start to meet our respective needs and start to address things collectively for a shared future in a number of different ways. That, for me, has been a really exciting trend, and I can see that continuing and deepening in the years to come.
Great. Now, you're obviously here with trends. We're at COP28. Explain to us the link between what you do and COP28 trends. How is this all coming together, and what can we expect as an outcome from this?
So, I mean, Trends, of course, I think is a brilliant thought leader in this country, in this region. I think some of the things that they've been doing around COP28 has been very, very multifaceted and interesting. I was just at an art installation that that they've put together with this young and up and coming environmental anthropologist from the UAE that's really brought some things to life.
20 years old, can you believe?
Thank you.
Right.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
And it really goes to show the power and the potential of the youth, right? In a very concrete and tangible way.
Sure.
And I think for me, some of these things are particularly important because something like the climate can be such an abstract thing to grapple with. These are huge issues that people are talking about, right? Like climate change, climate crisis, end of days type rhetoric and conversation in some quarters at least. And to really be able to make it tangible for the everyday person, I think is incredibly important, because insofar as governments have a massive role to play in this, big corporations has a massive role to play with this, individuals also have an important role to play, right? And I think to be able to kind of do this not just top down, but also bottom up is incredibly important. And I think that's the way in which all of these things are coming together.
Right. Now, you're also an advisor in emerging markets across Southeast Asia, Africa, Middle East. How do you see sustainability, renewable energy? How do you see that coming together or linking with this? In other words, do we see more investment areas or more initiatives when it comes to investing in these particular areas compared to traditional fossil fuel-based types of companies or other businesses?
Oh, 100%. But I think for me, what's even more interesting now is that increasingly we're starting to look at this in a more holistic way, right? So we're not just kind of treating it as silos, like, okay, here's renewable energy, here's sustainability, here's green whatever. We're starting to see these things as cross-cutting, right? So if you're looking at manufacturing, for example, how are you manufacturing in a way that's sustainable and green? How are you starting to bring some of these things into the conversation from the outset, as opposed to, oh no, we've already come this far and now we need to backpedal or backtrack or course correct in order to make something green. And I think that's happening more and more and more. I think in places like the African continent, which is where I've been living and working now for more than 10 years, it's my adopted home in a lot of ways. I think there what's really coming to the fore is a desire and a drive to really own their own agendas around these kinds of things, right? So in Nairobi, the Kenyan president just a few weeks ago in the lead up to COP28 hosted the Africa Climate Summit. And that entire event was around how can the African continent, how can African countries, which have such an enormous role to play in the green transition and are now suffering disproportionately from the effects of climate change, even though they're negligible contributors towards the problems, how do they take better ownership of their own value chains? How do they take better ownership of their own policies? How do they come more to the fore and the center of these global conversations as opposed to being in some ways the recipient of their outcomes? And I think that has been a very, very, very important development.
Very interesting that you mentioned that. Also, correct me if I'm wrong, not an expert in your field, but the one thing, if I understand correctly, is there's a bit of a challenge when it comes to getting financial institutions and banks on board when it comes to investing and funding certain initiatives, such as green buildings, more sustainable businesses, whether it's solar power, wind power, so on and so forth. How do you actually get financial institutions and banks to become more involved in this and shifting from traditional investment opportunities towards these new and more sustainable initiatives?
Another very big question. So if you're looking at a place like the African continent, especially like sub-Saharan Africa, there is what we refer to as an African risk premium, right? Where perceived risks and can often have very tangible outcomes. Already some of these like major institutional investors tend to be risk averse as it is, and that risk aversion is amplified when it comes to African markets.
Right.
And that's true of both conventional as well as new industries. So it's not so much about the industries itself as it is about the markets that are under consideration. So I think a big part of sort of moving the needle on this will first of all have to come around risk perception and making sure that countries are not being unfairly penalized just because they belong to a certain region or continent. I think that's a big part of what needs to happen. And then I also think, and I think this is already starting to happen again. There needs to be a multiplicity of options around these things, right? So you have your big institutional investors. They have a certain degree of inertia, right? They're big. It's going to take some time for them to make shifts in terms of like how they invest, where they invest, etc. It's going to happen, but the predictability around how much time that's going to take, it's hard to gauge, right? In the meantime, what are alternative options out there? What are alternative financial instruments out there? Where else can funding come from?
Sure.
And that also means local capital, right? Where are local pools of funding? Where are local sources of capital?
Right.
As countries and regions start to develop it more and more, we're no longer confined to one or two options. And I think that's really important to remember to make sure that we have that diversified portfolio that we can tap into.
Now, back to the word emerging markets. Give us an idea, a comparison between Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia. What do we see in terms of speed of emergence across these different markets?
So I feel like in some ways it's a little bit of an apples to oranges question, right?
Okay.
And also a little bit hard to make comparisons, especially because it's going to be different across different industries and sectors, right? So for example, if you're looking at, say, Africa's, and especially sub-Saharan Africa's, startup environment and startup financing landscape, right? Right now, or at least the last time I checked the data, which was maybe earlier this year, so things may have changed a little bit at least. Right now, the trajectory it's on and the kinds of comparisons that are being made, it's being looked at vis-a-vis where, say, Latin America was a goal, say 10 years ago, or where Southeast Asia was a certain number of years ago. And compared to that, if anything, the African continent is on a faster growth rate, and a faster incline, right? But it's a little difficult to say where it is currently, because the point of departure is going to be a little bit different, and also things change in the overarching environment quite rapidly, right? So the conditions that, say, Latin American startups were facing 10 years ago are going to be very different from what African startups are facing today.
Right.
So, but what I do see, what I think is quite interesting that's happening, is that the flows between the different regions and the relationships between the different regions. I think that is a more interesting thing to look at than sort of individual comparisons. Like, what are those points of interdependence? Where are bilateral and multilateral relationships developing? How is money flowing from into these regions? I think that is where interesting activity is happening, and I think that's where the real growth and opportunity will be seen.
Right. Speaking of startups, as an entrepreneur myself, what do you think some of the factors that are available across these different regions? What are the main factors that need to be there to ensure a successful establishment, but most importantly, future growth of these startups? And what's your advice in terms of raising funding for startups across the different regions? Would it be pretty much the same process? Is it going to be different and unique to each area in terms of how you raise funding and, you know, the small details that come with it?
Another big question, but a great one. So I think in terms of like what needs to happen, especially if you're looking at a market again like Sub-Saharan Africa or Africa in general, the numbers for the African continent are great. But if you dig below the surface, you'll see that there's a convergence in terms of where money is going, where startups are really sort of like proliferating, et cetera. And it tends to sort of converge around the same 4 to 5 usual suspects, right? You're looking at Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and Egypt. It tends to be those guys, right? I think it's important to make an effort and be deliberate about going beyond the usual suspects, right? We know Nigeria is a hub. We know Kenya is a hub. We know SA is a hub for the Southern Africa. What else is happening? Where else can we look?
Right.
Look, take Ethiopia, for example, right? I think Ethiopia is developing a really interesting sort of like tech landscape. But maybe people don't look at Ethiopia first for certain reasons, right? So I think it's important to kind of look beyond the surface. But again, to your earlier point, some of these things are also very contextual, right? Like the operating environment in which a startup exists, the policies that it has to deal with, the incentives that it has to deal with, or the lack thereof. I think all of these things kind of come together. And then, as I said, in a place like the African continent, there is that added risk premium that needs to be taken into consideration that I don't think exists in a place like, say, India or the UAE, right?
Sure.
So I think some of these things really have to also be contextualized.
What makes these 5 countries or the usual suspects the actual usual suspects compared to other countries? Is it the resources? Is it the investors who are willing to invest there and not anywhere else because of the risk factor? Or is it the actual human resources? What do you think it is that makes them a little bit ahead of the other countries? And how can we get the other countries? I mean, as you were talking, how do we get them on board?
So I think it's probably a combination of what you said, right? So a country like Nigeria is a behemoth, not just in West Africa, but across the continent of Africa, right? So I think if you want to play on the continent, you can't ignore Nigeria, right?
For sure.
Within sort of East Africa, Kenya is the other sort of major player. And same goes for a place like Egypt and South Africa. Also things like, connectivity, there's some sort of like historical factors. Like these things all kind of play into it. But I think what's interesting to kind of observe is who else is doing what and where are other countries trying to carve out niches and spaces for themselves, right? So I think Rwanda is a fabulous example of this, right? Rwanda is a very, very small country in East Africa in terms of just human capital and number of resources available, et cetera. It's much smaller compared to like a Kenya. But I think Rwanda has been incredibly smart about developing a niche for themselves and positioning themselves in very strategic ways vis-a-vis its neighbors and also just the broader region at large. So what are some of these other players doing to kind of differentiate themselves, right? Vis-a-vis one another, even as regionally the continent is trying to like identify more opportunities for intra-African collaboration, trade, investment, etc. Because I don't think those things are mutually exclusive.
What's emerging right now? I don't know how else to ask you, but what's emerging? What should people be on the lookout for?
In terms of country, sector, industry.
Sectors, industries, sectors. What's emerging?
I mean, there are so many. Do you mean specifically within Africa?
These three regions.
So I think generally industries that are tech enabled, there's a lot of emphasis and prioritization around that. And there's a massive diversity in terms of what that looks like, right? So COVID, for example, gave massive impetus
Sure.
to health tech, right? But there's also
What are,
Logitech.
what are the hidden opportunities that might not be as obvious, if any?
No, I mean, I think there's plenty. I think in terms of hidden opportunities, again, it's a combination of where are you looking, right? So where are your countries of focus? Are you still going back to the same countries, or are you trying to kind of like think a little bit differently about like, who's doing what? And I also think hidden opportunities will start to emerge when you start to look at value chains differently,
Sure.
right? So in a lot of African countries, unfortunately, in a lot of different ways, you're still at the tail end of a lot of global value chains, right? And since we're here at COP, there's a big thing around things like critical minerals for the green transition,
Absolutely.
green minerals, et cetera, right?
Which Africa is very well known for.
Of course, but always on the production side of it,
Sure.
right? On the extraction and production side of it,
Sure.
right? So the real opportunities now will be, how do you capture value on the continent? How do you create these value chains within the continent in such a way that we're no longer just exporting raw materials, but we're really manufacturing and bringing these things home,
Right.
and then exporting finished goods to the rest of the world, right? So I think a big part of where, and these are not necessarily hidden opportunities, but a way to look at opportunities differently, right? If you can
Sure.
think about value chains differently. And I think that's going to be very, very important also just for the world,
Sure.
right? Once African countries are able to move, and there's already steps being taken towards this, right? From a policy standpoint, from an incentivization standpoint, what do we need to do to capture more value within the continent?
Right.
Then we'll really see a plethora of opportunities open up that were always there, but we're just not being taken into consideration or not being incentivized appropriately.
Absolutely. We're here on Trending Echoes, a platform provided by Trends. What final words or message would you like to share with our viewers right here from COP28?
I think for me, one big thing is, and I've pretty much bet my entire career on this, so hopefully I'm right. But I really have a lot of faith in emerging and developing economies. I think this is where there's real growth, there's dynamism, there's innovation. I think for a very long time there was a lot of rhetoric around like, what is the center versus what is the periphery, and our part of the world was always considered somehow the periphery.
Right.
And the more time I spend here, the more work I do here, the more relationships I build here, I see how untrue that is. And I really think that as it seems to be, as we're moving towards this multipolar world where there are different power centers and different alliances that are coming to play or whatever, I really think that there's a lot of hope and potential and promise here, which I'm very, very excited to be a part of and very privileged to be a part of, working and building in this part of the world. I think that's one thing. I think the second thing that I'd like to say is COP28 is a very important, it's a very, very important convening. People from all over the world have come together to talk about our existential future, right? As part of this incredible planet. And for me, I think it's just a question of, ending things on a note of hope, right? I just hope that we're able to come together in ways that allow us to put aside individual interests.
Sure.
Whether it's at a corporational level or
Right.
a country level or an individual level, to really work towards some things that are good for the common
goals.
cause.
Right, absolutely. What would you like to see in future COPs? Would it be the same things? Is there anything that you would like to see in future conferences that would take place later on?
I think what would be great to see in future conferences, maybe less hedging. I think
Right.
I think there is some degree of hedging that happens, which also is understandable given just the sheer number of stakeholders that are
For sure,
involved,
for sure.
who are trying to achieve these common objectives. But I think what will be important to see in the years to come is more unity and clarity of purpose around
Right.
some of these core goals.
Absolutely. Well, I really loved what you had to say about the center, the peripheral, and all that stuff, and it gives me the feeling or the sense that you're the kind of person that roots for the underdog. Am I correct? Well, I have to say, Aparupa, it was an absolute pleasure to have you here. We really look forward to hosting you once again. You never know; it could be at the next conference. And once again, thanks for being here, joining us at the studio.
Thank you so much, Omar. Thank you for having me, and thank you so much for a very fun conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. This was a very, very special interview on day 12 of COP28, happening right here at Expo City in Dubai. I was your host, Omar, and we'll see you in our final interview.